welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Monday, August 11th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. How you doing?
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you as well. It is day 675 of the war. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that Israel isn't looking to occupy Gaza, but to free it from Hamas. The premier denies that he is seeking to prolong the war and says he has told the Israel Defense Forces to shorten the timeline for capturing Gaza City. We'll get into that as well as many other aspects of the Prime Minister's press conference that he held on Sunday night, first in English and then in Hebrew, and we'll talk about what that means as well. So stay with us. Okay, Jacob. So as you and I were discussing, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held this press conference, did the first part in English, the second part in Hebrew. There were some different questions and answers based on the language. Why don't we first talk about the English press conference? What were some of the subjects that he was focusing on there? Let's talk about the questions and answers, the questions he was being asked, the answers he was giving. Let's get into it that way.
Sure. So you had these two separate press conferences that were held several hours in between, and he started with the one in English for the international press. And it was interesting to look through, to go watch both of them and compare his focus of his messages for the first versus the second. With the international audience focus being a lot on the notion of kind of diffusing various what he called lies that have been told in the international press against Israel. And he went through various examples, but I guess beyond that, a top message he wanted to get at, which is what you mentioned at the top, which is he's stressing that Israel is not trying to occupy all of Gaza. I think why this is the assumption is that because for the past several weeks or so, as Israel decided how it was going to be responding to Hamas raising its terms in the negotiations that basically fell apart a few weeks ago, Israel then, the plan, first it was talking about annexing, it moved away from that, and then there was talk about occupying all of Gaza. Those were the conversations that were happening in the cabinet between Netanyahu and his advisors, with Netanyahu and the Trump administration. It was definitely using that term kibush, to conquer or to occupy all of Gaza. But the decision that was taken on Thursday night, Friday morning was to take over the Gaza City specifically. And I think what happened was we saw a recognition from Israeli officials, or Netanyahu chiefly among them, that occupying the rest of Gaza, be it all of Gaza City and the remaining areas of central Gaza and those camps as well, that would mean Israel be responsible fully for all services for the Gaza population there. And Jeremy and Amanda talked about this on the most recent podcast. So I think because Israel was not in a position to say we want to be in charge of providing all these services, so we're just going to focus on Gaza City and moving the population out. And somehow we'll be able to convince the UN and other international organizations that they'll be in charge of providing aid. We'll just continue facilitating it, but we're not going to be occupying. So that was one point that he was really trying to stress in on this press conference. Then he talks, of course, he goes through the decision, and he did this in both, of that was made on Thursday, and talking about the 5 principles that the cabinet had agreed for, that basically the only conditions for that Israel will agree to end the war. And then basically explaining his decision to move away from the strategy of hostage deals, particularly partial hostage deals. Now, if you recall, this was the framework that Netanyahu wanted. It was not what Hamas had been pushing for. They wanted a full deal that just basically releases all the hostages in exchange for an end to the war and Israel leaving the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu has been adamant that he would not agree to that because he argues that this leaves Hamas in power. So the alternative that he proposed and pushed from, I guess, May of 2024 until now, or until the past few weeks, was to try to let's do partial deals. We'll get some hostages out and maintain the ability to resume fighting. That worked basically twice in that first November deal, and then again in January of this year. Where you had some hostages and then Israel coming out and then Israel resuming the war afterwards. Now, Hamas has, I think, made it pretty difficult to allow for those conditions to be maintained. And therefore, Bibi has come to a new conclusion, which is that the only way to release all of the hostages is through military pressure. It's, I think, trying to square a circle in a bit, because what we've seen over the past few months is that military pressure has not really succeeded in releasing the hostages. And I think there's always been this dichotomy between trying to win the war on the one hand and release the hostages on the other. And Netanyahu is arguing that they really still, the two can go together. And finally, much of the English press conference was focusing on dispelling the notion that Israel was trying to starve the Gazan population. That if it wanted to do so, if it wanted to commit genocide or starve them, then it could have been done in a much quicker pace. That Israel would have done that if it wanted to. Israel clearly does not trying to starve the Gazans, and therefore has been letting aid in, albeit we can get to in the Q&A where he's pushed on that policy a little bit. But basically, we are allowing as much aid as we can in. Hamas is trying to loot the aid or making it more difficult for us to get it in. And he basically scolds the press for accepting various Hamas claims, or what he says are Hamas claims, about starvation. And he highlights several pictures, I think 3 pictures he pulled out that of photos of very malnourished looking Gazan children who were suffering from pre-existing conditions. It came out after the fact that it wasn't just that they were not getting enough food, but it was that they also had these pre-existing conditions that had nothing to do with malnutrition. But obviously, I think at the same time, malnutrition exacerbates those conditions as well. But that was, I think, the main point of this was to try to really dispel this notion, because I think Israel's going to be moving forward with its military operations and wants to be able to still have the international community to some degree believing that it is at the same time still trying to get in aid as it's fighting Hamas fighters in Gaza City.
Jacob, did he also focus on public diplomacy efforts for Israel in the English press conference or in the Hebrew? Because I know he did talk about that.
Right. So I think it was interesting to see the focus on the public diplomacy effort. I think what he more talked about was, in the English side, he recognized that Israel's been losing the information war, and he basically faulted concept of bots on social media platforms that are elevating and pushing anti-Israel sentiment. And he says that's a major reason why. And they're specifically even going after Republican circles to try to hamper Republican support for Israel, which is something that we have seen deteriorate a little bit. And it's something I've written a little bit about. We talked about on the podcast. And he's arguing that this is due to, I guess, bots that are disseminating anti-Israel information. The focus, I think, in the Hebrew press conference on this was a little bit more on why Israel, the perception in the Israeli public that the government is not doing enough to stand up against this. And he gave an answer talking about that there is bureaucracy that was a problem beforehand. But they've actually turned the tide. They've created this new staff in the foreign ministry that's really addressing these issues quite well.
Any other issue that really got pushed and focused on in the English press conference?
Yeah, related to aid, he was pushed again about the concepts of starvation and whether Israel's behind it. And he was asked specifically about, there was a 2-month period, Prime Minister Netanyahu, when from March 2nd to May 19th, that Israel did not allow any aid into Gaza at all for 78 days it amounted to. And that's the kind of the crisis that we're now seeing is as a result of that very long period where you didn't allow any aid into Gaza. And Netanyahu's response was that actually what we did was we had a simultaneous effort where on the one hand we stopped the aid from coming in through existing mechanisms, and on the other hand we built these GHF, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution sites to get in aid around Hamas. Now, first of all, those efforts were not simultaneous because the GHF sites didn't start operating until a week and a half after Israel started allowing in aid once again through the UN system that it was so critical of. So that the concept that this was a simultaneous efforts it is just not true. But more than that, he argues that GHF, he admits, was not so successful because we didn't have enough distribution sites. But the reason that there weren't enough distribution sites is that even GHF was saying from the get-go, we want Israel to allow us to open a GHF site in northern Gaza. And Israel never allowed that to happen. And as a result, northern Gaza has been seeing some of the more difficult conditions in terms of famine or anything close to that nature. And Netanyahu appears to recognize that this is an issue, and therefore we're allowing more sites to be established. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee talked about as many as 16 being established. I do think that's going to take time, but it's going to be happening at the same time as the UN mechanisms that are going to be operating at a larger scale. And that basically, I think the main channel will now, even though GHF will expand, they're still going to see a lot more UN operations if they're able to, because there's this recognition that Netanyahu is saying that now we need to flood the zone with aid, which was a wild thing for him to talk about because for months, his argument was that we only need to allow the very most basic amount of aid to come into Gaza. Now he seems to be accepting the argument of the UN and the international organizations, who he was very critical of and saying that they weren't doing enough to get aid into Gaza. And he even made the comment that part of the reason why GHF has not been successful is that Hamas has been successful in intercepting much of the aid that was going to GHF. Now, that is something that GHF has been adamant about, that all of its aid has been able to get from the border to its sites because it uses armed guards in order to transport the aid, that none of it has gotten looted. Netanyahu also made the point that part of the problem with GHF was that also part of its aid or its operations were being intercepted or interceded by Hamas, which is something that GHF has been adamant has not been happening in terms of all their aid has not been looted, that it's been able to get from the border to their sites because it uses armed guards. And that's how they've differentiated themselves from the UN, where there's been a lot more self-distribution, looting happening because of the different systems that they use. So it was interesting to see how Netanyahu, on the one hand, argued for expanding GHF's operations, but then on the same time was somewhat critical of the way that it rolled out initially, even though part of that rollout the constraints of that rollout were Israeli constraints.
Okay, so let's take a quick break. And when we're back, we'll talk about the Hebrew press conference and what were some of the subjects spoken about there and how it was different, how it differentiated from the English press conference. So stay with us. Okay, so let's dive into that. The Hebrew press conference came afterwards, correct, for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Hebrew media. And what was he focusing on there? Because presumably it was not the same exact subjects.
Correct. I think this was more of a focus on selling this Gaza City operation to the Israeli public. So there's slightly different arguments that you're going to make. Definitely, again, he went through the decision that was made on Thursday night, Friday, and basically then moves on to also explain why he feels that deals are no longer possible to release to release the hostages. And then he made an interesting point to review the various victories that Israel's made in this war, including in Gaza, in order to, I think, give legitimacy for it to continue. And also made a point to recognize the strain that's been felt on the reservists. I think this has been a very sensitive issue for Netanyahu. I think he's more exposed to criticism as his government is trying to pass legislation that will grant pretty blanket exemptions for Haredi yeshiva students to avoid military service. So he makes a point of recognizing, I get that that the reserve force is very strained, and that's why I've ordered, as you mentioned at the top, the IDF to finish the job very, very quickly and finish Gaza City so that we can relieve some of the strain on the reserve force. What has to be noted on this issue, though, is that when you ask the IDF to move quicker, I think when you ask the IDF to move quicker, it does risk more harm to soldiers, because I think the way that the IDF is operated in Gaza, and Manny will talk about this a lot, is that it operates not slowly, but very methodically to make sure there's a lot of firepower used to make sure that soldiers aren't put in harm by the time they have to have face-to-face, possibly contact with Hamas militants. And so if you push the IDF to move quickly, you run the risk of placing soldiers in harm. So it'll be interesting to see how the IDF works with that command, whether this is a formal demand or this is something that Netanyahu is just saying in the press. But the other point that he was forced to reckon with in the press conference is that, if you recall, he's held these press conferences before, where he's tried to sell various major operations. Last one was the Gideon's Chariots, where it was also framed as, this is the last thing we need to do to basically defeat Hamas. But even more so was the press conference that he held about a year and a half ago, in the spring of 2024, about the operation in Rafah. And that was also framed as, this is the last thing we need to do. We just need to go into Rafah and dismantle the final remaining Hamas battalions that are existing in Rafah after we cleared the entire strip. And now it's all down to Rafah. And once we finish Rafah, then there'll be just several more weeks. They'll be done. There'll be just several more weeks of fighting, is what he was quoted as saying to CBS and in his one of his social media videos that he had been posting to keep Israelis updated on the war. That was his message then. So he was pushed on, why are you now talking about Gaza City as this final Hamas stronghold that we just need to dismantle, and then we'll be able to win the war and get all the hostages back? What happened then that now that apparently wasn't the Rafah operation the final nail in the coffin? And basically what his response was to a question about that was, well, in the meantime, we had major successes in Lebanon, in Syria, and Iran that cannot be ignored at all. That wouldn't have happened, I guess, if Israel didn't continue fighting in Gaza. I guess that's the argument that he's making, that we needed to continue the fighting in Gaza in order to continue to launch the major operation against Hezbollah that led to the crippling of Hezbollah, that led to the collapse of the regime in Syria, which was then followed by Israel's very successful 12-day war against Iran. I don't know if there's a real connection between Gaza and those three other fronts. And Netanyahu did not specifically address that, I think, discrepancy there. And I'm not sure why the argument that this is simply going to be Gaza City and then we're done, when he's even also talking about that, yeah, we also have another stronghold left after this, because this operation that we've approved is only for Gaza City. There's also the central Gaza refugee camps that have been also somewhat untouched. There's been plenty of airstrikes there, and much of it has been hit. But Israel hasn't gone in full throttle into the central Gaza coastal area near the Mawasi and others, because it doesn't want to harm the hostages. Similar reasons for Gaza City, that it is now taking that risk in order to try and defeat Hamas. So even if we succeed in Gaza City, people should remember that there's going to be another press conference that Netanyahu will likely have to issue in order to explain why now we're going to have the final fight in the central Gaza areas and the Mawasi safe zone, if you can call it that. The other question is that when Netanyahu talks about giving time to evacuate and the civilians the space to do so, and corridors and enough humanitarian aid, is what we've seen in the previous operations is that, yes, there are some Hamas operatives that stay back and fight against Israel and fight against the IDF. What also happens is that many of them just simply evacuate with the civilian population. And what you're just continuing to do is further entrench the insurgency campaign that I'm not sure moving into Gaza City will really change. And then after that, when we move into the central Gaza area, we're just going to see many of the Hamas operatives simply evacuate with the rest of the civilians. And I think that's one of the major criticisms of these types of operations.
Right. And then basically he closed it out after that. In other words, he was focusing on that because that is the headline of the moment. That and humanitarian issues in Gaza, and we'll wait to hear what happens next, from him at least, in terms of his words.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. There were a couple questions about whether or not, a couple of questions coming from the definitely the right-wing spectrum of journalists, about whether or not he's willing to simply, this is all just a ploy, and that really Israel is going to agree to a deal, they'll stop halfway and get some hostages out. And Netanyahu's response is no, that I'm going all the way with this, that I'm not interested in any more partial deals, and that the only way to get the hostages out is through this defeating Hamas, not even through a deal. He used the term through a deal once and then corrected himself to just say simply defeating Hamas. I think it's an interesting shift that he's made in order to move the public away from the concept that we're going to be able to have another deal to get hostages freed.
He wants to make that as clear as possible from his standpoint. Okay. Jacob, thanks for taking us through it. It's been helpful to hear.
Thanks, Jessica.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times Visual's Daily Briefing, and stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, you can always drop us an email, podcast@timesvisual.com. Until next time, take care, be well, have yourselves a good week.